Understanding time as an opportunity in fencing is paramount if the fight is to evolve further than two fencers simply exchanging blows. In this presentation, I hope to demonstrate why understanding opportunity is not only preferred course, but necessary in the true expression of fence. Fencing has two main components, that of offense and that of defense. The true fight contains both, and knowing when to sacrifice offense to defend and when to inhibit the defense for an offense is good. But to understand that every offense must also contain elements of a good defense, and the contrary, that every defense must also have a potential to offend, is quintessential. In both the offense and defense, we are looking to minimize the time required to perform each. Some contributing factors that will dictate the time of our offense are these: the distance our offensive portion of the weapon needs to travel to its target, the distance the foot or feet need to travel, and to a lesser extent the entire body, to allow the weapon to come forward during the strike, moving the weapon to the target as it presents itself through the motion of the opponent's weapon and/or feet, known as the arisen in German fencing, and the parrying of our weapon to the foot or feet. All of these factors will determine the relative length of our offense. Conversely, the contributing factors that will dictate the time of our defense is the distance the defensive portion of our weapon needs to travel to the line of attack for a parry, the distance the body needs to travel, and to a lesser extent the feet, to move out of the way of the weapon, known as voids or avoidance, the restraining of the motions of the weapon and body during the course of a fight, limiting the opponent's opportunities and time, and the moving of the weapon ahead of the body and the feet. Balancing these two columns of offense and defense, and to be able to apply both when the situation calls for it, even though at times they are in direct conflict, will help us understand opportunity. The offense and the defense, as it relates to time, can be summarized as such. The time of our offense must be made in a shorter time than the opponent's defense, while simultaneously, the time of our defense must be shorter than the opponent's offense. To categorize the previous list into understandable and compartmentalized terms, we can rewrite them like this: the space of the weapons, both the offensive and defensive portions, and how they cross, is the engagement or the bind. The distance the feet must travel for any given action is the measure. The way we impose our actions within that of our opponents, whether making actions of indes or nachreisen, is external timing, while the way we pair our weapon to the motions of the feet is the internal timing. The first two will give us opportunities in space, space of the weapons and bodies, while the second two will give us opportunities in time. Let us first look at the space of the engagement. Here, the time of both fencers' offense is longer than either's defense. Both offensive portions of each fencer is further away than either of their defensive portions to the line of attack. If either fencer makes a direct attack from this position, the other will be able to parry in time. In this illustration, the time of both fencers' offense is shorter than either of their defenses. If both commit to the offense, both will find it difficult to defend simultaneously. Here, the fencer on the right can make their offense in a shorter time than their opponent's defense, while the time of their defense can be made in a shorter time than the opponent's offense. You'll notice that I've preferred to call these spaces the engagement rather than the bind, as only the first illustration showed the weapons in a bind, while the second two are not. It is equally important to understand the relationship of the weapons at all times in and out of the bind. Measure was our second component when dealing with the time of the action, and is a much simpler concept than some of the more intricate ways the weapons may find themselves. In this first instance, the fencers are at a distance where the time of the offense is shorter than the possible time for the other to defend with their body alone. The further the distance between the fencers, the larger the measure, the more space, and thus time is required to bridge the gap, thus lengthening the time of the offense and decreasing the time of the defense. One consideration when judging distance of the fencers is the ability of the feet to support the body in its motions. The ability of the striking foot to cover distance is a function of where the non-striking foot is in space. For weapon arts dealing with the accommodation of the dominant foot for the strike, the non-dominant foot determines the distance at which the body can reach. In these scenarios, we can say that if the rear foot is close to the front foot, then the front foot is more able to reach further. Hence, a close stance is good for offense, while a wide stance is good for defense. The above examples lack one critical element, which is timing. The space an object must travel will dictate the amount of time required to finish its action. But the timing of the action, or in other words, when we choose to make the action, is equally important. Given that actions of the weapon are generally quicker than those of the body or feet, the appropriate time to move our own weapon is while our opponent moves their weapon, while the appropriate time to move our feet is while our opponent is moving their feet. Otherwise, the time of our action, offense or defense, will be longer than our opponent's opportunity to respond. Both external timing, when we begin to impose our actions within those of the opponent, are just as important as our internal timing, how we pair the actions of weapon, body, and feet. A lack of both or either will inhibit our ability to respond and adapt to the fight in front of us. Here, we see the fencer on the right has gathered the rear foot forward in order to put their body into a position where the dominant foot can extend more easily and readily for the strike. If the fencer on the left was stationary when the fencer on the right sought to strike, then the fencer on the right will inevitably fail in their attempt because of a problem of proportional time. Because the fencer on the left was stationary with their feet, they are prepared to go back if necessary, without a necessary motion of the weapon to defend themselves. The time of the opponent's attack cannot compensate for the sudden loss of measure. If, however, the opponent on the right were to time their action to coincide within a step from the opponent, then the fencer on the left will be preoccupied with the step they are already in motion making, and not able to perform a different step that would grant them the avoidance, as long as their initial step wasn't backwards. The larger the step the fencer on the left makes, the larger the opportunity for the fencer on the right has available to commit their own foot. The same concept can be applied to the motions of the weapon. If, in the previous examples on the engagement, the opponent was stationary with their weapon, they have an available time to move their weapon where necessary to defend. If, however, they were already in motion with their weapon, then we can use this as an opportunity to move our own weapon, not only in time of theirs, but to the place they just left, as their weapon cannot occupy the place it just left in the same time. If the fencer on the left provides both a motion of the weapon and that of the feet, in this case lowers their weapon and steps forward, then the allotted time the fencer on the right has available to commit an action, and even an attack, is greatly increased. Whether an attack is successful is a function of the space it needs to travel and the allotted time the opponent offers to complete the action. The simple solution for the fencer that feels like their actions can be exploited in time is to simply not move, or constrain their actions to such a small degree that it would be impossible to beat them to any target in time. We can answer this by either decreasing the space of both weapon and body so that the time of the action relative to the opponent's opportunity to respond is negligible, or we can force our opponent to make a motion, thus giving us a moment in time in which we may act. Forcing an action or creating an opportunity can be accomplished in two ways. First, a taker, an action on the opponent's blade, a bind, that minimizes the time of our attack and maximizes the time of both their defense and possible offense, creating a space and time for us to act within. Second, we can provoke them to move their weapon, giving us an opportunity in space, engagement in measure, and in time. Provoking can be performed offensively as feints and defensively as invitations. The goal of both is to put our weapon and body into a position where the time of our offense is shorter than their defense, through the creation of space and building opportunities in time. The goal of the feint is to, at a minimum, force the opponent to respond with a motion of their weapon, while we put our own weapon into a position that both defends us if they choose to respond simultaneously, and into a position that minimizes the time of our offense. However, if the opponent only responds with a motion of the weapon, and not of the feet, then again, we will have a problem of proportion. The time of our weapon and feet will be longer than their ability to create space, though not entirely impossible to overcome, makes our earnest attack more difficult. The goal of the invitation is to entice the opponent to make a motion of their foot or feet, either in pursuing us or in attacking us. We can make motions of the weapon or body, or both, that will entice the opponent to close space with their weapon and feet. We can do this by forming a position of the weapon that gives the illusion the time of their attack will be shorter than our defense, or by stepping back, or acting as if we were, to force the opponent to step forward. While the opponent commits to their step, or attack, this affords us the opportunity in time to strike. The method in which we pair or time the action of our weapon to those of our foot or feet are directly tied to how we time our actions within those of our opponent, and will help minimize the time of our offense or minimize the time of our defense, but not both. If we are proceeding against an opponent who has not offered a time or moment for us to make one of our own, then we should more closely tie the action of the weapon and feat. This will minimize the time of our attack, but also sacrifice the time of our defense. If we are proceeding against an opponent who has offered a time or moment for us to make one of our own, then we can lead the action more with the weapon with the foot following, elongating the time of our offense, but shortening the time of our defense. To the right, we can see the given time for a motion of the hand or weapon and a relatively longer one of the foot. These are not absolute and are permeable based on the specific action, but in general, actions of the hand are quicker than those of the feet. In the top left, we see a simple action of the weapon closely tied to a longer action of the foot. To the immediate right, the same action of the hand and foot, but timed differently, where the hand moves well ahead of the foot. The relative length of the action on the right is longer, but safer, and again best used in situations classified as indes, or timed within actions of our opponent. Underneath are two compound actions. The first, one where the action of the hand coincides more closely with the foot, and in this example are nested entirely within. The last sequence are the same two motions of the hand timed so that they occur before the step, before bringing our targets closer to the opponent, lengthening the time of our offense at the expense of minimizing the time of our defense. These are the two extremes, and timing of the hand and feet can be adjusted as necessary to adapt to the situation at hand. The last consideration of time is the time of the thought, or mind. This is not explicitly stated by Meyer except for his discussion on the four types of fencers, but time can also be measured in how far in advance we can pre-plan our actions. If we have an opponent who behaves in a predictable fashion, or an opponent we have forced to respond in a predictable way as discovered in a previous engagement, then we can use closed-circuit actions, meaning they are pre-planned and thus do not use a time of the thought to complete. However, they are less apt to adjust the change once begun. These actions can also be used with an internal timing of hand and foot together. Against opponents who are more erratic or unpredictable, an open circuit method should be employed. This is where, as we create one action, a feint, we wait to see how the opponent responds and then finish our action, earnest attack, based on their response. These actions require time of the thought and are thus slower, but more adaptable. They are also best paired with hand before foot internal timing. I hope this presentation finds you well, and stay safe.